Hello and welcome to the program. This is another episode of Beyond the Mekong for The Diplomat. And with us today in Bangkok is David Armstrong. David has an illustrious career in Australia and in Southeast Asia, where he has been the editor of the South China Morning Post and on the boards of the Phnom Penh Post. He's a former editor of the Bulletin, the Australian, the senior ranks with Rupert Murdoch and Kerry Packer. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Luke. It's great to see you.
You worked with Rupert Murdoch and Kerry Packer and obviously go back decades in terms of the Australian media. How do you rate it today?
Read the Australian media today.
Yeah.
Overall, very superficial. There's a guy called Sean Kelly, who's one of the best political commentators in Australia, who wrote Australian Politics in a discourse where the superficial and the simple are being elevated above the complex. And I think that applies to the media too. There's a lot of coverage of politics which is just about the politics and not about the policy. A lot of gotcha questions, as they call it.
Yep.
It strikes me a lot of journalists doing interviews desperately trying to get a headline. Can you rule out, Mr. Politician, can you rule this out? Or can you guarantee that this will or will not happen? It's got nothing to do with actually eliciting information or discussion about policy. It's really just trying to get a headline so they can say the Prime Minister or whoever refused to rule out X and Y and Z. It's very superficial. I think it's been called by some people horse race coverage of politics, and that's about right. It's where the opinion poll becomes far more important than the policy.
And the politicians are feeding that part of the beast?
The politicians feed that as, I guess they feel they don't have any choice, but I think they actually do. We saw it in the last election campaign in Australia where someone asked Adam Bant, the Greens leader, a gotcha question about what is the wage price index, and Adam said, Google it, mate, just Google it. I think when politicians are asked a stupid question like, can you guarantee X, Y and Z, the answer should be, can you guarantee that you're going to get up in the morning?
Right.
So stop asking stupid questions. That should be the answer.
I remember before the last election, during the campaign period, I think Anthony Albanese was asked a question and he just looked totally mystified. An advisor had a word in his ear and his response was, that was 11 years ago. What are you talking about? And everything just went like that. The differences between Kerry Packer and Rupert Murdoch, how did you find working with them?
Actually quite good. Neither of them were as interventionist as most people believe. Kerry, in particular, didn't intervene at all. He had this funny system at ACP where all the senior people had an internal telephone, which is a little yellow telephone on their desk. And if Kerry called, there was a special ring. And Kerry liked to be called chairman, so he was meant to pick it up and say, hello, chairman. So anyhow, one day, it only happened once, I got the phone gave the special ring, and I picked it up and said, hello, chairman. And he said, I've got someone here with me who reckons that I interfere all the time. Is that true? And I said, no, of course not. And I got the impression, he just said, thank you very much, that's it. But I got the impression that someone who was there was Joh Bjelke-Petersen, the late Queensland Premier. But that was pretty true. He didn't interfere. Rupert would discuss his ideas about politics or the economy or business, and there's never an instruction, but you're aware of where he was sitting, and sometimes just had to work around that a bit. When I was editor-in-chief of The Australian, I had a pretty good brief, which was basically to make the paper a little bit more popular and commercially successful without departing from the basic values of the paper. So Rupert would come out a couple of times a year and talk, and most of the time it was a very pleasant talk, and sometimes he even said thank you. But you knew that every fifth or sixth meeting you're going to get a kick in the head about something. Right. The thing that Rupert got most upset about was if you picked up a story that was critical of his business operations, he'd get very upset about that. And he'd complain.
If it came from the Wires or...
It came from the Wires or another paper's service. And he'd say, oh, well, he really didn't appreciate being defamed in his own newspaper. But basically, these are things he just worked around. It wasn't an ongoing or existential problem.
When you look at the Murdochs of today and how far they've gone in the United States and their impact on elections, were you surprised by the kind of extent the global reach has and its influence in American and British politics as well as at home?
Look, I know, in a sense, no, because I kind of grew up with that. I started my career at the Australian at about the time that he bought the London Sun.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd seen the empire grow over the decades and been peripherally involved in some of it. I was surprised, I guess, by the extent to which people perceived his power.
Okay.
I think Fox News, for instance, for a long while was basically attracting like-minded souls. So it wasn't converting people, it was just getting an audience that already agreed with this right-wing point of view.
I remember decades ago at university making a study of Murdoch papers, and the conclusion really was based on the elections in the 1970s, which saw Whitlam come in and oust Malcolm Fraser becoming Prime Minister. I think it was with the Australian that when they backed the Liberal Party, they lost sales, and that the ability to sway an electorate and the arguments that they could sway an electorate were quite dubious, so they could enhance and degrade public opinion, but their power, I thought back then, was overrated.
Look, I have a memory, I may be wrong, but it's still in my mind, in Margaret Simon's biography of Malcolm Fraser, he said something like he appreciated Mr. Murdoch's help, but he really didn't need it. I was involved then because I was writing editorials in the Australian, which basically said, "Kerr must act, Gough must go." Yeah.
Right.
There are 100 different ways of saying that, but that was the brief. And I was also very close to a guy called Rod Cameron, who was then working for a polling company called ANOP. Later became a big pollster for the ALP. But Rod said that the drop in support for the Whitlam government predated the media campaign against him. The people had already made up their mind, and the issue for them was competence or incompetence.
Right.
All the media campaigning had no effect whatsoever. And that's my experience. If we go back to, I think it's the 2016 election in Australia when the Daily Telegraph brought a high-powered editor in from New York to run their campaign for them, and what happened was he didn't move a seat. Malcolm Turnbull almost lost, despite all the Telegraph's furious campaigning. Malcolm Turnbull almost lost that election.
Right.
I think the power of the media is in politicians' minds more than anything else. The media has a power because the politicians' perception of the power of the media. So they act according to their perceptions of the power.
I was talking to a trade unionist not that long ago, and I was asking him about in Canberra, the obsession with politicians and Sky and ABC television. And his response was, when you walk into Parliament House these days, and it has been a while since I've been there, along all the corridors, televisions, every corner.
Yes.
One has ABC, the other has Sky, and the politicians just like to see themselves on television.
Yes. But they must know that in both cases, they're going to quite small audiences.
Right. Indeed. Moved to Hong Kong, I think it was around 1993, South China Morning Post, Bangkok Post, the Sundays. You're currently chairman of UCA News, mainly based out of Bangkok, but elsewhere as well. And you're also a columnist with Pearls and Irritations, online magazine in Australia. What you experienced in Australia, is that applicable to newspapers in East Asia? And I'm particularly thinking of the South China Morning Post, which was a Murdoch paper at one point.
Yes. Well, in terms of the basic news values and the basic way you put paper together, it's applicable anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
What I found with South China Morning Post was that you had to be more conscious of the position of the proprietor, the owner. So, funnily enough, when I was appointed by Ken Cowley, who's Rupert's right-hand man, to be editor of South China Morning Post. Rupert subsequently sold the paper to Robert Kwok, the Chinese-Malaysian businessman. And Rupert said that he thought he had a choice with that paper. It was either to sit on it so that it was not critical of China, or to sell it. And he thought in the end that selling it was better. Mind you, he made a lot of money in selling it also.
I'm sure you wouldn't mind that.
The politics of the South China Morning Post is a bit difficult because you had to be watching Hong Kong, what was going on in Hong Kong and the government.
Yep.
and what was going on in China.
And this was, of course, in the build-up to the handover in
build-up to the
1997.
handover, yes. And to be a bit simplistic, I think the policy of the paper beforehand had been Britain good, China bad.
Right.
But we thought the paper actually had a role in trying to manage the expectations about the transition. We didn't thunder, as they used to say at times, editorials didn't try to argue strongly against China. Mainly, we tried to work by persuasion and explanation to say why Hong Kong was different to China, why it needed a different approach. Particularly as the handover got close, China had been quite obstructive on some major infrastructure programs, and we said, you've got to stop this, because this is what you're going to inherit. And if you don't let these projects go ahead, you're going to inherit a mess.
Right.
And also we said China should be reassuring the people of Hong Kong, not bashing them up all the time. Now, in both cases, they changed their policy. Now, they may have worked it out themselves. They probably would have. But I'd like to think, without knowing for sure, maybe we had just a tiny bit of influence there.
The immediate years after 97 were... There was always someone complaining, but those years were quite constructive in many ways when you look at what happened around 2005. I think things started to change, the umbrella revolution,
yes,
and so forth. But how do you rate these newspapers today? The South China Morning Post, Singapore Straits Times, the Japanese papers, India. You've got a very good mind in regards to all these publications.
Yeah. I think if we make a general proposition that none of them are as good as they used to be, none of them had the finances they used to have. But papers like South China Morning Post and Straits Times in particular are still quite good papers. Straits Times is a bit soft on criticism of the local government, the Singapore government, but its coverage of what's going on is quite comprehensive. Its regional coverage is very good, particularly its coverage of South China. Its China coverage is very good, and its international coverage is good. South China Morning Post, again, is a little bit soft on China editorially, but it covers China news in a pretty straightforward kind of way. And has quite a number of columnists who are very critical of China. So it's still quite a good, solid paper. A little bit closer to home where I am, a paper like the Bangkok Post is very light on for news, but the editorial line is still pro-democracy and quite progressive. So it's...
And in Cambodia, you were chairman of the Phnom Penh Post Group, which has just closed its print edition, and from what we're told, it will not be maintaining an online publication. That's disturbing, and it's the end of an historical era, which goes back to Michael Hayes, the United Nations peacekeepers, and international efforts to resurrect Cambodia from its status as a failed country.
And it was always a very good little paper. Because that's physically it was.
And it's Cambodia, it's British and small, but it mattered.
It was a very important paper. I must say, in my time, there was no interference from the Cambodian government. They didn't seem to worry about the English language press at all then, although that's since changed. The big difficulty always was circulation, because there weren't so many English speakers, English readers, and advertising. So it was financially always a battle with the Phnom Penh Post. And as time went on, and as the digital sources of news took over, that became even more difficult.
I remember there were major issues with newspapers around the region after the 1998 financial crisis, in that the airlines were big advertisers, and after that they never came back. I remember the Far East Economic Review complaining about that, along with several others. And Phnom Penh Post, they actually had advertising agencies in New York who would bring in advertising, including Omega watches, Rolexes, that kind of thing, which helped enormously. But then when the internet landed, there was this 5-year period where advertisers didn't want to advertise, but the advertising from online, which still isn't great, it took a long time to graft to the media industry.
Yes. I think there were two crises for the media in Asia. One was 1997-98 crash. The other, of course, was what we call the GFC, the Global Financial Crisis. 2008. And at the same time, the digital world is gathering pace. There are fewer people reading the traditional media, and fewer people interested in advertising in it. And it's been a great struggle for newspapers in Asia. I remember at Bangkok Post, the guys did a thing, relaunched a Sunday paper in 2008.
Right.
And they put in a new magazine and put in a weekly kind of news review section.
That would have been Spectrum, if I remember correctly.
Yes, Spectrum, yes. And Sunday newspapers in Asia in those days did not attract advertising. So the only way to pay for this was to increase the cover price. So the cover price had been 25 baht at the time, as with the daily paper. We put that up to 40 and put the paper out there, and circulation rose.
Right.
And funnily enough, what we hadn't anticipated was advertising started coming in because we had these sections that could be read during the week as well. So the paper got increased circulation and became a net contributor to the profits of the Bangkok Post Company rather than a drain on the profits. But of course, as the digital world and digital news spread and circulation went down and advertising went elsewhere, so we only had that beneficial effect for a few years.
You must have worked on 20, 30 mastheads at a very high level when newspapers or the magazines were going through a trough and you need to raise that. How difficult is it to go to a board and say, we've got these new ideas, we want to do this? Are they welcoming, or do they want to have a say in what you're doing? I mean, how difficult is it to get these ideas across? And of course funding that goes with it.
Yes, I tell you, at Bangkok Post, it was quite a serious civil conversation, and everyone understood what we were trying to do, or people who mattered understood what we were trying to do, and we got the support we needed. Funnily enough, at News Limited, back in the late 90s, we had a terrible time getting support for a website for the Australian. We put a proposal to management, and we worked out a way to do this without spending a fortune, and still we couldn't get any funding for it. And there was a belief in the management circles that Rupert at that stage was opposed to the internet.
Right.
Well, he probably wasn't happy with the internet. I don't know that he was ever stupid enough to be opposed to it, but we couldn't get the support, so we just quietly assembled a small team who worked on building a website for the Australian. And then at one point the management went over to New York for annual budget discussions with Rupert. And Rupert said, well, of course a paper like the Australian should have its own website. And they came back and said, oh, it's okay now. So we launched, I say it was within 3 days, but it probably wasn't exactly 3 days. We launched very, very quickly after that. And then we got the funding we needed. But it's probably a bit of a surprise that the most difficulty in getting money for new ideas was at News Corp rather than Bangkok Post or South China Morning Post.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. I remember the South China Morning Post under your stewardship the first time had done very, very well. Then you'd left and the paper had gone downhill. One of the main arguments was that Kwok and Co simply didn't want to put the money into it. And then it had gotten so bad that people were complaining loudly and you were brought back and also given a budget to revive the paper. Is that true? Or is that...
It's kind of true.
Right.
Like a lot of things, it's kind of true. It is true that the circulation was going down, advertising was going with it, and it was compounded, of course, by the onset of SARS. Right. I was brought back, but I wasn't particularly given a budget.
Okay.
In fact, the very first year, the paper's profit was I think, from memory, it was just above zero. Maybe it was $100,000 or something. It was very small now. And we were advised if we had any capital expenditure to put into that year, because that was going to be a bad year anyhow. So we bought the Beijing Bureau a new car.
Oh, nice.
Before the end of that financial year.
Chinese made.
A Honda, actually. And, but it is true that we got more support and we were able to change the paper, and got particularly some more marketing support, which was important, with a very good marketing director, top-class marketing director called Amanda. And we eventually got the circulation back up. It had gone down to below 90,000. We got over 100,000. But one of the big disappointments was working with people who didn't understand the media business. They didn't realise that getting it over 100,000 in that climate was actually an achievement. You talk to people around the world and say we've increased circulation at the time, the dot-com crash and so on, and SARS, and they were flabbergasted. But to the Quacks, that was just what you did. Of course,
Right.
that's just what you did. Yeah.
There's also been a lot of criticism over the last few decades about the involvement of hedge funds, equity managers who have come in to the news game and demanding 10, 12, 14% incremental increase in profits every year, which anybody in journalism can tell you that simply doesn't happen.
That's right.
And it can be a profitable business, but it's never going to be that high. How is your experience with these types of characters, or your observations of the industry going through that sort of additional upheaval on top of the internet, on top of crises like SARS, financial collapses, that kind of thing?
Yeah, fortunately, I never had to work in a company that was taken over by the hedge funds. I imagine it must have been very bloody difficult for the editorial managers, particularly because you're going to save costs. How do you save costs? You kick people out the door.
Yep.
Now that can be done, and I've had to do a couple of downsizing exercises, but it be done carefully and thoughtfully. But I gather with the hedge fund operations that they just want the numbers down, and the reduction was just done wholes bolus.
Mm-hmm.
As long as they got the numbers, they didn't
Right.
care. They didn't care who. They didn't care what kind of institutional memory was walking out the door. They didn't care what kind of quality writing was walking out the door, as long as the numbers were going down.
Okay.
Whereas if you manage it, you can get the numbers down and still have some hope of making sure you don't diminish the quality of the paper too much.
As a seasoned journalist, I do have to ask your what are the most memorable stories? I'm going to do that for another reason. I mean, obviously, you've been involved with every major story going back 40 or 50 years. What are the standouts? And my next question would be, where do these stories impact on sales? Because not every story is going to impact on readership the way one might think.
Sometimes the big stories impact negatively.
Right.
If we go back to the early 90s to the former Yugoslavia, which was a terrible scene, we knew in the Australian, if we splashed on that and made that the main story today, just because it was, we had a commitment to international news, we knew we'd lose circulation. The Falklands War, however, going back to that, we knew we would increase circulation if we splashed on that, because that involved people like us.
Right, so the positive connotations of a British
Yes.
phobia kind of thing, and the Yugoslavs, recent arrivals, immigration.
Yep. Let's just politely say that people felt a closer connection with the British.
Right.
One of the biggest stories I was involved in actually happened after I'd left the paper, which was the death of Deng Xiaoping.
Okay.
I had prepared a 4-page wraparound for the paper covering the death and his life and times. Got that already made film, put it aside for when it happened. It happened after I left, but it happened quite late at night, early in the morning. They got the news. They just pulled out this film, changed the dates of his life and death, and away they went.
Ready to go.
Ready to go. Yeah.
In terms of the big popular stories, over the last 20, 30 years, I'd imagine Princess Diana was...
Princess Diana was one of the very big ones. That happened in Australian time on a Sunday afternoon, so we had a bit of time to get everything organised. And I had a very good number 2 called Campbell Reid, who subsequently became editor of the Daily Telegraph and a very senior executive at News Corp. And Campbell kind of took charge of that and did a great job. And yes, it was a very big sale, and so much so that the Herald Sun later pinched some of our ideas.
Right.
for their use. In terms of reader interest, that may well be the biggest story in my time.
It's extraordinary, really. The biggest stories obviously to come, but not that many. I'm thinking 9/11, financial crises are always a big deal, but it's not the stuff of the popular imagination.
Although you might be right about 9/11, I'm remiss saying 9/11 was a very big story, huge story, and one that stayed on the front page a long time.
Right. Is there a model in the media industry going forward, given the digital world within which we live? I think everyone's waiting for advertising rates to go up, but we could be waiting a long time.
Look, if I had the answer to that question, I would bottle it and sell it.
Right.
And I'd make a lot of money, I'd hope. It's difficult because running a good news operation is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And when the advertising support is so low and the circulation is so low, it's impossible to make money, and very difficult to see what the way around that. So at the very top end, some papers have managed to put together a print and digital operation that together makes money.
Right.
Like New York Times, for instance.
And the Wall Street Journal
Wall
as
Street
well.
Journal. I'm not sure about whether the Australian papers are making much money, but the operations are successful enough for the owners to keep it going. But I remember to get a good digital operation also costs money.
Sure.
And I remember a few years ago talking to the Bangkok Post people, just kind of chatting, or trying to be supportive, even if I was out of it, about revamping their digital operation, which at that stage was and still is quite basic. And the guys there knew what they had to do, but they thought about 100 million baht, which is about 3 million US.
Right.
And the paper just didn't have it.
It's a large sum.
Didn't have it to spare.
And then taking this conversation full circle, it still comes back to content. Tell me something I don't already know. And what some people would say cheap-ass journalism that we can see online, the elevation of superficiality, as you were mentioning earlier, that's not going to help, I would imagine. I mean, this is the clickbait kind of mentality, which has risen to the fore over the last decade.
One of the things in the past, before there were so many different news sources, was that you could sell on news. News was a big seller. News was a big, big deal. If you had an exclusive story, that was a big thing. Now, because there are so many different ways of getting news, a lot of the papers rely on their positioning. In Australia, it seems to be a lot of them rely on a right-wing positioning to get that audience, an identifiable audience, and they seem to be more interested in opinion and culture wars or political positioning generally than on news itself. And news, of course, has, if you're in a newspaper business or media business, news has a much shorter shelf life.
Indeed, especially these days. But everyone's nicking each other's stories and pretending it's theirs.
That's right. So you have a paper that comes out at midnight, say 1 minute past midnight. It's on websites everywhere, with or without attribution. So that's one of the big things that's changed. The whole paper's reason for being has changed, and the nature of the paper has changed. I was having a chat a while back with Benjamin Law, who's a journalist and author and playwright in Australia, and he described the Australian as a centre-right paper. And I said, no. It was centre-right when I was the editor 20-odd years ago. Now it's just right, simply right. And I think we refer to the mainstream media. I think in Australia we really should be calling it the right stream media, because they're all right-wing. Even the Guardian can be disappointing at times.
I'd say the same about the ABC, which likes to present itself in a kind of left-leaning way. But the reality is that it's, I find it mildly right-wing.
I think with the ABC News, that's right. The ABC News presentation is very tabloid. Politically, they have this belief that they must be balanced, and that requires giving the opposition as much space and time as the government. And you see that too in the papers at ABC. They really want to quite minor stories from the opposition get a big run in this sort of false equivalence approach to news.
I had seen with the Australian media in that the government might have a policy announcement, but it could be a story that's not that important, and there's no real accompanying statement. So they ring the opposition for a quote, and then the lead is opposition.
Slams.
And the lead is hysterical, and it's kind of like, where did this come from? Why is this important? I tend to see that a lot.
You see that a lot. You see quite trivial pronouncements from the opposition getting a very big run. And I'd say that they've forgotten about the news value. Their primary role as journalists is to assess the news value.
Right.
If you're a political reporter, the easiest story in the world to get is an opposition story, because everyone wants to talk to you.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get good government stories because they tend to keep things secret. So it's a very lazy form of journalism, and it really does downplay their role as journalists in assessing the news and making some critical judgments about the value of stories.
In the media industry and the difficulties with making it profitable, it's still not going away. It's going to roll on and on and on, and it will be a benchmark of democracy. It always will be. So, as a final note, caught between a rock and a hard place.
Yes, but you're right. You're right. It is still going on, and a lot of the papers are doing a job that we might regard as disappointing, but a good job in all the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at, say, a paper like the Jakarta Post, mm-hmm. Quite critical in holding the government to account, and quite critical on issues of human rights. It's an important contribution to the notion of democracy in Indonesia, or even if its news content is not as strong as it used to be. The same for a paper like the Bangkok Post. The papers like Straits Times and South China Morning Post are stronger, and I think they can keep going for some time. And maybe there are other papers like Asahi Shimbun, which is a subsidiary of a very big, powerful empire in Japan, can keep on going for a long time too. Certainly hope so.
So the future is not entirely bleak?
Oh, just quite bleak, but not entirely.
David Armstrong, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Luke.
Cheers, mate.
Thank you.